Greetings, listeners, and welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion production. I'm J.J. Kimchi. Barukh, or Benedict Spinoza, is one of the most influential and controversial Jewish thinkers of all time. On the one hand, Spinoza, who lived in 17th century Amsterdam, is considered one of the greatest of all modern philosophers. His system has been widely discussed, appropriated, and admired by many of the intellectuals who have created our modern world. On the other hand, in more traditional circles, Spinoza has been treated as an arch-heretic, a mortal threat to all conventions of religious belief and political order. Over the coming weeks, we shall be embarking on a three-part series on Spinoza, examining his radical ideas on philosophy and religion, as well as considering his legacy among future thinkers. In this first episode, we shall be outlining the general contours of Spinoza's philosophy, primarily as imparted in his posthumous book, The Ethics. It is in this work that Spinoza lays out the full extent of his worldview, and the manner in which it clashes with long-established views on metaphysics, ethics, and religion. With us to delve into Spinoza's general philosophy is Dr. Newberger Goldstein, a renowned philosopher, novelist, and public intellectual. Having received her Ph.D. in philosophy from Princeton University, she has taught at many institutions, including Yale, Dartmouth, and NYU. She is the author of 6 works of fiction, as well as several works of non-fiction, including Betraying Spinoza, the renegade Jew who gave us modernity, which will form the subject of our discussion today. She has been awarded the MacArthur, Radcliffe, and Guggenheim Fellowships, and in 2015 was awarded the National Humanities Medal. It is a pleasure to have her with us today on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. Dr. Goldstein, welcome.
Very, very pleased to be here.
Excellent. In the course of jumping into Spinoza's life, I would like to read out a short text, which I'm sure you are familiar with, which I think offers us a good insight into a pivotal moment in Spinoza's life. And the part of the text at least goes like this. Cursed be he by day and cursed be he by night. Cursed be he when he lies down and cursed be he when he rises up. Cursed be he when he goes out and cursed be he when he comes in. The Lord shall not spare him, but then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy shall smoke against the man, and all the curses that are written in this book shall lie upon him, and the Lord shall blot out his name from under the heavens. No one should communicate with him, neither in writing, nor accord him any favor, nor stay with him under the same roof, nor within 4 cubits in his vicinity, nor shall he read any treatise composed or written by him. And this is, of course, the writ of excommunication, or the herem, against Spinoza in Amsterdam in 1656. Dr. Goldstein, perhaps you can, certainly based on this text, enlighten us a little bit as to Spinoza's life, his biography, and what was it that precipitated these curses and these thunderous words against Spinoza?
Well, that itself is a question of some debate, because perhaps I should say Spinoza was 23 years old when these very solemn curses fell on his head, and he had yet to publish anything. And he had kept himself part of the community. What community? Okay, it is a fascinating community, and I don't think that one can really understand Spinoza, understand his system, without knowing something about the community in which he was raised, which was the Portuguese Jewish community of 17th century Amsterdam. This was a community that still called itself the Portuguese nation. They spoke Portuguese. Spinoza never felt particularly comfortable in Dutch. He wrote in Latin. They were all refugees or the children of refugees from the Inquisition that was still raging in Spinoza's day. There were people there had relatives back in Portugal who were still living as though sometimes, as hidden Jews, as Marranos. But of course, Judaism had been declared illegal on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain in 1492. And then a few years later in Portugal, the Jews of Spain, I'm sure this is familiar history to your audience, the Jews of Spain were given the choice to leave or to convert. I mean, and this had been preceded by centuries of butchery, of pogroms, basically. And the most stalwart of them who did not want to convert, even the rabbis converted, because if you left, you had to leave all your property. They tended to be well-to-do. They were established parts of the community, often very high up. The most stalwart left, and where they mostly left was to Portugal. And so it was a terrible tragedy when the king of Portugal, who was arranged a marriage between his son and the daughter of King Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain, invited the Inquisition into Portugal. He didn't make the mistake that Spain had made. He didn't allow the Jews to immigrate because it had a devastating effect on the economy of Spain when so many Jews left. Between 150,000 and 300,000 left Spain. We don't know exactly. And so they went to Portugal. But the King of Portugal also gave them 25 years to adjust to being Catholics. And what this meant was that being a crypto-Judaizer, a hidden Judaizer, was more established in Portugal even than it was in Spain. First of all, it was the stalwarts who had left. Secondly, they had a chance to set up, their ways. This was the history that lay behind Spinoza's community. As I'm sure you all know, when the mechanism of the Inquisition was horrific, anybody could accuse their neighbor on any grounds. Even extreme personal hygiene could be a ground of accusing somebody, or wearing nice clothes on Saturday. The Jews of Portugal developed a kind of sausage that looked like pork, was white, but was made out of chicken and veal, that they could hang in their window. So it looked like ham. And it was, it's very established ways were set up, Jews of Portugal. But if suspicion, anybody could and it could be done in secret, could accuse you. And then, this whole horrible institution fell on you. You were burned to death in the Auto de Fe, and suspicion fell on your whole family. So if anybody, whisper of suspicion fell on anybody, the whole people would decamp. Amsterdam was the place of choice. Amsterdam had won its independence from Spain. Amsterdam was the freest city in all of Europe. They allowed the Jews not only to live there, but they wanted them to be real Jews. They didn't want any free thinkers, actually. And so this was the community. They did very well. They were very affluent. From the outside, they seemed to be secure and thriving people, very, very nervous people, traumatized. Life was insecure. They were always being watched. And they always were being watched. I just wanted to say, because I might forget, that there's a whole lost period of Spinoza's life after his excommunication, his herem, I should say, and before he surfaces again. There are about 4 years where we don't know what happened to him. An Israeli scholar found records in the Vatican of Spinoza because they kept tabs on everybody. Once your ancestors had been Christians, as all of their ancestors had been Catholics, the Vatican felt that they owned you, they owned your soul, and they kept tabs on you. So we actually know those 4 years, what Spinoza was doing from records that were found in the Vatican. So yeah, this is a very nervous, traumatized people. And that's where Spinoza came from. He was educated. One of the first things they did was, of course, to establish a Talmud Torah. It was called Keter Torah, the crown of Torah. It was really, I suppose, a marvelous school. And that's where Spinoza was educated. That's his only formal education. Everything else, he was self-taught, including the Latin in which he wrote. He was a prize student. They expected him to be a great laude. And, well, things happened. What happened exactly that he got that herem brought down on his head? We're not exactly sure, because, as I say, he hadn't published anything, but he did speak, and people would ask him questions. Spies seemed to have been sent to ask him questions. He seemed to have denied 3 things, saying that there's no proof for it in the Torah, that God can't be thought of in material terms, that there are angels, and the immortality of the soul. He denied all 3 of these things, and this was reported back. There are other more political things that had happened that might have contributed to his herem. Why was it so stringent? Because the rabbis they had their, I come from a rabbinical family, I know how difficult it is to be a rabbi. They had their hands full, these rabbis, because, I mean, this was, as I say, traumatized and ignorant. They were very ignorant about halakha, about Yiddishkeit. And a lot of them, I mean, had been priests before. This was a very safe thing for a new Christian to do in Portugal and Spain, become a priest. In fact, my favorite saint, Saint Teresa of Avila, she was a Marrano on both sides. You know, she was an amazing Catholic thinker. But so, I mean, and so they had many people who were, when they learned what Judaism really was, no, they knew better. They didn't like it. They didn't like the accretion of Talmudic law. They thought Judaism was the Torah, 613 commandments. That's it. You know, what's all this other stuff that the rabbis are adding? And so, you know, it was a rambunctious, refractory community. And so they used the herem quite often, the rabbis, as a way of trying to keep order. But it was always temporary, depending on the severity of your sin. It could be a few days, it could be a few weeks, a few years even. Spinoza's is the only one on record which was permanent. No chance of returning, as you read. You know, he cursed all the days of his life. Nobody could speak to him and his family, and I think that had something to do with his showing his independence. He didn't really care. There had been a very famous person, Oriel de Costa, who had been put into herem twice as it happened. Each time he begged to be let back in, and he was let back in. Promised to believe all sorts of things he didn't really believe, and he ended up committing suicide. Spinoza was the exact opposite. He was not going to beg. He didn't show up for his excommunication, and when word was brought to him that he had been put into herem, you know, he said, "Well, look, I would not have done it myself. I didn't want the scandal, but now that they do it, I go off as innocent, knowing I'm as innocent as the Israelites when they left Egypt." You know, so he was independent. And I think that really got their goat. I think this really annoyed the rabbis who had so much faith in him. He was their most brilliant student.
That's fascinating. And of course, Spinoza then goes on to do something that was almost unheard of or unprecedented at the time, which is just to live as a citizen.
Lives as a citizen. He did not convert, although it would have been very much in his interest to convert, but he didn't convert to Christianity. He is the first person of the modern world to try to live as a secular person before the term was even invented. Secular. There was everybody identified in terms of their religion, Muslim, Christian, you know, many different types of Christianity or Judaism, no, he refused.
Interesting. Okay, let's jump into Spinoza's philosophy. And I'm going to ask you to do what is naturally very difficult because people have spent thousands of pages doing it, which is essentially to summarize Spinoza's major points, but specifically as they as the implications for religion, because of course the point of interest here is that he was excommunicated from the Jewish community and has been, as I said earlier, reviled and seen as a bitter enemy by Orthodox Jews and Orthodox Christians for many generations.
Yes.
Can you perhaps give us an outline of his philosophical framework, and especially as why it would be seen as so oppositional to mainstream religion?
Yes. Well, he is really oppositional
Okay.
to. He really is. I'm not.
At least they got that right. You know.
Yes. You know, when he finally did publish, actually, his great work, the Ethics, his magnum opus, was published after his death. He had many indications that it was unsafe to publish it. And I should say, you know, after he was put into herem by the Jews of Amsterdam, and the herem, by the way, only extends as far as Amsterdam, but it remained for Christians the world over to condemn him. And even, I must say, the great fellow rationalists of his day, Leibniz, you know, and the rationalism means a particular epistemological view, a certain view of knowledge, anti-empirical, and Spinoza is a very, very strong rationalist, stronger than Descartes. Leibniz, who was very, very influenced by him, denounced him because he was a cowardly, craven, pusillanimous man. Leibniz. He borrowed much from Spinoza, but when Spinoza's book, the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, was published under a pseudonym, but it soon became an open secret that it belonged to the heretic Jew. Um, you know, Leibniz said, I can't believe that this man has sunk so low. So he's seen as Satan's emissary on earth among the Christians as well. Okay, what did he say? And this is before the ethics. I'm going to tell you about the ethics, which is my great love. And I mean this truly. I always say to people are always surprised as a New York intellectual. I've never been in psychotherapy. I've never, no, my way of dealing with everything is Spinoza's ethics. I read Spinoza's ethics, and that gives me equanimity. That gives me the detachment to deal, with what life throws you, as it inevitably throws you much.
That's a fascinating insight. But then explain to us, why is it? What does the ethics give us? Yes, what is it? We're on tenterhooks here. Yes.
How? Why? What is it? What is it? Okay, after all of this build-up, yes. He has a major intuition, and once you know this, everything falls into place. His intuition is every fact has a fact. There is no brute contingency in the world. It's not turtles all the way down, it's reasons all the way down. There, so we have laws of nature, and we try to explain things according to laws of nature. But the laws of nature, they have to be explained too. Everything has to be explained, and there just can be no dangling threads from the fabric of reality. Everything has an explanation. To Spinoza, this intuition, which many physicists, I come from a background in physics. I came to philosophy by way of physics. Many physicists share this intuition that, the math is going to explain everything. We're going to understand not only what the fundamental laws are, but why they're the fundamental laws and why they had to compel existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? That there can be no brute facts anywhere. That's Spinoza's intuition, which he puts on a par with logic, with the law of non-contradiction. You don't have to prove it. They are the principles with which we think, with which, and we can't prove everything because otherwise we don't have the materials with which to prove things. But Spinoza sneaks this presumption of the explanatory completeness, let's say, into what he takes as the materials of logic. And so from that, he gets everything. What does he get? The world must, to truly know what the world is, which we can't because the world is infinite, and we are finite, so we can, our knowledge is incomplete. We can know that everything is explained, but we can't know all the explanations. The world is the explanation of itself. It has to be, if this principle of explanatory completeness is to be satisfied. He calls that the world in its completeness, where everything is really logically connected, God. That is God. So there's no room for a God to have chosen the world. There's no room for a transcendent God. It says God, and this is a quote, God is immanent in the world, not transcendent from the world. So, there's no act of creation. The world had to exist in all eternity. And it unfolds in infinite ways, of which we only can grasp a small part. And so the notion of a transcendent God who decides things outside of the world, who is a personal God, who pays any attention to us. He who loves God cannot endeavor that God should love him in return, for that would be to wish God not to be God. A direct quote from the Ethics. Already you can see, right? I mean, prayer is absurd. The prophets were full of imagination.
Revelation is impossible.
Revelation is impossible. Miracles, of course, are impossible. God is the necessary being of the world. How can God contravene what God is himself? Again, it's funny to use the personal. It's not himself. There's nothing personal about this God. It is very much like what the physicists talk about when they talk about the final theory of everything. The theory that will give us all the laws, will explain why they have to be the laws, and why these laws had to be realized in existence. And he also gets out, as of course, because he called his magnum opus ethics, ethica, he gets out ethics. So we don't need the traditional God, the God he calls the God of the superstitious religions. We don't need it to explain the two basic questions for which God is brought in. Why is there something rather than nothing? And why do the laws exist as they do? And what's the difference between right and wrong? How ought we to live our lives? He gets that out. He tries to deduce that. Nothing can lie outside of this explanatory net, the implicate order from which everything is implied, because it includes everything that can be explained. That's his concept of God. It's very much misunderstood. Even, I'll tell you, don't want to sound arrogant here, but even by Spinoza scholars sometimes, because he uses that word substance, and they think he's using it in the way that Aristotle had used the notion of substance, and that there are many different substances. There can only be one substance, called alternatively God, for Spinoza, and all of this follows from this fundamental intuition, which is not a bad intuition. It could be true.
And what about that system would allow for comfort? And you say you read the ethics of comfort.
Yes.
So there is presumably there is something. What is the ethical worldview that follows from this?
Yes. So it's a kind of. I'll tell you how you make your way. And I have to say, when I teach, well, I don't teach anymore, but I used to teach Spinoza, and it was, you would watch the students. First of all, they would join together in a way that no other classes would, because they were going through something very powerful as they go through this. It's a kind of detachment from the self that you end up with. He talks about, what a pleasure it is to understand. It is the pleasure over which we have complete control. He's very down on romantic love. I dedicated my book on Spinoza to my husband. We had just gotten together at that time, and I said, for Steve, despite Spinoza, because I love my husband, but he's very, he's really a kind of self-sufficiency, a kind of stoicism. There is an influence from the Stoics there that he preaches, and the one thing that we really have control over is the progress of our own understanding, and it is for him an emotional progress. It is a ethical progress, and it is in some sense a spiritual progress, that there is a kind of state of transcendence that comes about, and a kind of detachment, but a comfort in that detachment. I'm one little implication of this whole mess. I'm so grateful that I was implied, but you know
How wonderful it is to be an implication of something so great.
Yes, that's right. And there's a certain, a certain joy in the understanding. Freud was very, very influenced by Spinoza, which he acknowledges, that he was, that in understanding your emotions, because he talks a great deal about the emotions. His third book is all about the emotions. Yeah, really the fourth book, which he calls Of Human Bondage, which was used for a very famous novel. But that title. But too bad. I'd love to use it for title of a novel. It's a wonderful title. But, of human bondage is, to be a slave to your passions. It's not that he's against emotions. There are negative emotions and positive emotions. And the most positive emotion is the emotion of understanding, to understand. And it's, he says it's not for everybody. It's definitely not for everybody. And I actually even have a theory, to read, Spinoza wrote in this very eccentric mode. It's Euclidean. It starts with definitions and axioms and proceeds on to proofs, and the proofs grow with each other. He'll use the theorems of some of his proofs as axioms of the next, proof. So it's Euclidean, ending with QED, quod est demonstratum. And I think that's an old Morano trick that they developed in Portugal, to keep those who are going to misunderstand away, to cloak it, so that, that's not for me, I'm just going to, and he understands this. He understands that not everybody grooves on proofs. Not everybody grooves on being reasonable. And he has things to say about that too, especially in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, which is much more meant for those people.
Yeah, and presumably he thought that even if people didn't get the groove from that, perhaps they ought to.
They ought to, and they would be better off for it. But look, in the infinite, so you could ask, sometimes my students would ask, well, why didn't he just make us all more reasonable, all smarter, so we would all understand that is God? Why didn't he? Well, because that's not the way what God is. God is, everything. Here's how strongly he means this intuition that I spoke about, this explanatory completeness. If there's no reason for something's not existing, it will exist. So as long as a thing's existence doesn't entail a contradiction, it will exist. So it's just such a fullness of reality that he gives us, and so bad things are going to happen. We are not the center of the universe. The world was not created for us. That's the world wasn't created, and it certainly wasn't created for us, and it certainly wasn't created for the Jews. And that's one of the things he rails against. This notion that the Jews are the center of the unfolding.
You described your students. I remember taught Spinoza theology a couple of times, and I think one of these times at MIT, students of mine, and one of them said to me afterwards, he said, "Isn't this just atheism with extra steps?" Which I thought was an amusing characterization, and that characterization has always stuck with me as perhaps being legitimate. In other words, is there really a difference between saying that God is identical with the entire natural order and all the processes within it, to saying there's no God at all? I mean, isn't this a slightly more sophisticated form of run-of-the-mill atheism?
Yeah, you can look at it that way. It squeezes out any conventional notion of God. And he says in the Ethics, he says, look, my endeavor here is not to explain the meaning of words, but to explain the nature of reality. And so he tells us that he's changing the meanings of words. As I already spoke to, is substance, which is a word he uses, and totally changes its meaning. And freedom, he very much changes its meaning from what most people would think of as being freedom, because this is a completely deterministic system. And yet he says that the aim of the rational life is to be free. So obviously he's changing this notion. And he's certainly changing the notion of God, what it is to be God. But so here is, I would say, some explanation for why, even though it so distorts the usual notion, he's trying to give it a meaning which he thinks is consistent with reality. The other one is not consistent with reality. Atheism, you could call it. Or let's change this notion of God. So what is God-like about this thing? One feels reverence for it. One feels awe for it. One feels love for it. Amor de intellectualis. This is the highest state of, when you just feel, you understand it enough that you love it. You understand your place in the universe. Why you're here, what you ought to do with yourself by understanding this God, his notion of God. So there are some divine and it can bring you, and here I can personally attest to this, to a state of sort of transcendence, of a kind of rationalist ecstasy, which is a kind of spiritual state, a complete acceptance of what is. One would have to live a very different kind of life than, for example, I live in order to be a true Spinozist. Well, not to have children who you love beyond anything in the world, right? Or partners who family who you just love. No, there are certain things he's telling you. People are very important, but your relationships with them should be loose, friendship, and help each other, but not this kind of, my life can't go on if something bad happens to these people. No, all of that is ruled out. But getting back to the religious question, I think he's really sincere when he expresses his dismay at being called not a religious person and an impious person. This to him is a religious feeling. And I have to say, this is exactly parroted, this notion, by Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, he talks, and he says, this is not, how we usually think of religion. There's no personal God who loves us. There's nothing personal about this. But it is a sense of the glory of existence, of reverence for existence, the beauty, the sheer intelligibility. Didn't have to be that way, but that's the way it is. Well, of course, Spinoza says it did have to be that way, but there's some divinity there, and you either respond to it or you don't, and Spinoza is not out to convince the world, just enough people who can take solace in his vision.
Right. It's interesting to me because, as you say, Spinoza's view of the world can be seen in a very sparse and very
cold,
harsh and unfriendly. Sorry,
yes,
say again.
Cold,
yes, cold,
yes.
Harsh, sparse, unfriendly way. Except the way he writes. There was one German poet who called him, I think, God intoxicated. He talks a lot about God and loving God, as you say, and a relationship. Do you think there is perhaps? I mean, one of the things with Spinoza, one of the extraordinary things with Spinoza, is just how consistent he is. That unlike many philosophers, there is a Spinozan worldview that once you understand it, it accounts for absolutely everything, and that's one of the beauties of it in a way. But now I think about it, I mean, there's a sort of a tension on the one hand with Spinoza, who sometimes writes in this very cold or very geometric way. This follows this, and this follows this, and this is the way it has to be, and it couldn't possibly be any other way, and because any other way would be entirely illogical, and what is must be. But then he goes off in these flights of fancy about loving God and adoring God, and you could take those paragraphs out of context and think, wow, this is a profoundly religious man.
Yes.
And, I don't know exactly what to do with that.
Yes. And it's completely sincere on his part. Of course it is, and even his saying, well, for example, what he says, towards the end about death. First of all, he says that the free man thinks least of all about death, and his whole life is a meditation on life and not on death. He feels that what he calls the superstitious religions so play on our creaturely terror of death, and promising us, this afterlife, so they draw so much of their persuasion from terror, our creaturely terror, but that there is a kind of immortality in which we partake to the extent, that we have not a personal immortality. This modification of the infinite substance is not going to persist after the necessary death, but But I was entailed by this whole thing. I can see that I was entailed by it, and I can take pleasure. That ought to be enough. Is it enough? I don't know. I know it. It's not enough for when you lose dear ones. No, But of course, I'm not a consistent Spinozist.
Right, it would be difficult to imagine someone.
My kids would not have survived. You can't be a consistent Spinozist.
But again, a consistent Spinozist might be able to bring up children, but just say that I'm a poor Spinozist or a hypocritical Spinozist. Let's say.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I guess that's what I will say.
So you're of the opinion, I think, as you expressed before, that Spinoza's system really is entirely inimical to let's say organized religion, because there have been those who've, I mean, yeah, there have been those within intellectual history who've tried to square the circle. In fact, I mean, you mentioned, or we spoke a bit before about Spinoza's herem. There's another source that I like to bring when discussing Spinoza, which is the opening speech that Josef Klausner gave at his inaugural lecture at the Hebrew University in 1924. And one of the, I'll read it in Hebrew and translate. One of the lines is, "L'Spinoza hayehudi nikra 250 shana acharei ptirato, מעל רמת הר צופים, etc. מתוך מקדש המעט שלנו, הותר החרם, achinu ata, achinu ata, achinu ata, which means you are our brother. Spinoza, 250 years later, we are lifting the ban on you. And there is, I mean, this wasn't necessarily within a religious context, but there has been, in certain times and places, a sort of return to Spinoza to try and welcome him back into the fold, Jewishly and, and by others as well. I mean, what do you make of this? Is this just wishful thinking?
Well, I don't know. It's hard for me to know what goes on in other people's minds and what is motivating them. Spinoza, he didn't object to religions, if they were tolerant and they allow, there's, for example, when he was dying, actually, so he had a very, very nice landlord who actually saved his life by preventing him from doing a very incautious thing, very brave but incautious thing. But his wife was a nice, simple woman who would make him chicken soup when he was dying of tuberculosis. He died at age 43, 44.
You mean the landlord's wife? Because Spinoza was
yeah, the landlord's wife. Yes,
Spinoza was a bachelor his whole life, which is important. It's a salient fact, actually, that many philosophers over the generations have been unmarried men.
Yes, but a lot of them were Catholic. But and so there is that tradition. But our greatest philosopher also was not married. But she said, she asked him, is she in the right church? I think she was in the Dutch Reformed Church. And he said, yeah, it's good. It's good for you. He thought, for a lot of people, religion is good. It keeps them honest, charitable, and, as long as it didn't become crazy, was not, crucifying people and having inquisitions, it was okay. But if you really have the worldview of Spinoza that he is giving us in the Ethics, you are not going to believe in the religions. Yes. Do we want to claim him for our own? Yes. We love our brilliant Jews, right? Yes. I mean, he's an amazing. So, and I think he comes out of Jewish history. One of the things with my students, they're always in the throes of their hormones. And so, they would always, he must have had his heart broken by some woman. And there's, some story about Franciscus van den Enden's daughter. Van den Enden was a defrocked priest from whom Spinoza learned his Latin, studied with Latin. And, he had a daughter, and suppose, maybe he liked her, and people make up these stories. But I don't think the love that broke his heart was for a woman. I think it was the love of his community. I think Jewish history meant something to him, and I have some proof of this, that it had meant something to him. the suffering, which was, the long story, and what that was going on in such a violent way during his lifetime. And his community was obsessed with what is it to be a Jew. This was an obsession because they had relatives. It says, where does it say? You would remember better than I, that every Jew has a stake in the world to come. And
it's the 10th chapter of the Mishnah and Sanhedrin. So it's
right. Thank you.
Every Jew has a stake in the world to come, and then of course goes on to list those who don't. But that statement stands as an important statement.
Okay. Yes. So these people, they had embraced Judaism. They were trying to live as halachic Jews, but their relatives back in Portugal, couldn't be circumcised, couldn't keep anything, and so. Did they have a state? Are they Jews? What is it to be a Jew? This was a controversy that ripped apart his community. The community had 3 rabbis, one Ashkenazi rabbi who was the head rabbi, Mortiari, and then 2 who had been born in Portugal. And the Ashkenazi rabbi, he said, no, you have to be, not every Jew has a stake in the, you have to live by the laws. You have to be a Torah Jew. And the other 2 rabbis, Menashe ben Israel, very famous rabbi, and Aboab, said no, to be a Jew is to be hewn from one log or something of this sort, and you don't have to be obeying the laws. And this was a very fraught controversy, and Spinoza was surrounded by this sort of thing. And what he finally decides is, it doesn't matter, to the extent that we're rational, which is what we ought to be, rigorously, consistently rational, we all share in the same identity. We are all the same. We have the same ideas because our ideas are conform to reality, as he said, and we have the same aims. And we're together. We understand each other. And this is his way of thinking out this question of, that so tormented his community was, it doesn't matter what a Jew is. If you're really rational, we're all going to be the same. And this, of course, was an idea that seeded the Enlightenment 100 years later. This is a pivotal notion of the Enlightenment. Yeah, you can read the ethics, and I kind of read it that way, as what he's trying to do is remake our identity. That it's a how-to not your passive identity that you inherited from your forebears, but the identity that you make for yourself by thinking things out.
And which leads me a little bit to another question which I had in mind. So a few weeks ago, we had a professor on here named Naomi Seidman, who's writing a book on the reception of Freud, and she gave us a very stirring admonition, which is, we keep asking how Jewish Freud was, and how Jewish this person was, how Jewish that person was, and why are we so interested? What is this morbid, almost voyeuristic interest in exactly how Jewish person was? But the question, I think, with Spinoza has to be asked, because of course, with many parts of, let's say, the ethics, you could imagine anyone of any nationality or any background, any persuasion having authored this. On the contrary, the whole point of it is that it wrenches itself from any possible context. But then, but the question then has to be asked: do you see within Spinoza's overall worldview something essentially Jewish, something that could not or was much less likely to have developed under other conditions? And of course, his alma, the TTP, the Tractatus. So that's largely an attack on Judaism and engages in a lot of insider baseball. So the answer to that would obviously be yes. Against Maimonides and Ibn Ezra, and there's a lot of there's a real strong critique of the Hebrew Bible, and we'll address another time.
Yes.
But just his overall worldview, do you detect strong Jewishness within that?
Well, see, that story that I just told, he's so radical. He's called by the historian, what's his first name? His last name is Israel, a very famous British historian.
Jonathan Israel.
Jonathan Israel, yes.
He just brought out a 1,300-page book on Spinoza's life and time.
Oh my gosh, yes. And he calls him the radical enlightenment. I mean, he's so radical. Something was very radical, I would say, in this very brilliant, sensitive, observant, he's a keen observer of human nature as well, with a sense of humor. Very buried, but it's there. And something happened that would wrench him into such a radical view, especially in those times when it was such a given that who you was so determined by the religion into which you were born. That was your worldview, and I would say yes, it had to be from this background, this so aware of human suffering. The thing sometimes I would say it's Cartesian Kabbalah, because there are two things that the Kabbalah really concentrate on, that Descartes and Leibniz, and they weren't interested. The first is, why is there something rather than nothing? What was the very beginning? Why is there anything? Why is there a world? And the second is human suffering. Human suffering. How it's so it's too much human suffering, right? And the suffering of innocence, the suffering of children, which of course, continues very much into our own day. And he wanted a worldview that would answer those Kabbalistic. He knew Kabbalah, Kabbalistic. In Kabbalah, the Sephardi community Kabbalah was their baby, and as I said, two of the three rabbis were Kabbalists. Aboab very strongly. In fact, he was a follower of Shabtai Tzvi. Many in the Amsterdam community were followers of Shabtai Tzvi. Anyway, I do think that the radicalness of this person came from his Jewishness. Also, it's not exactly foreign to the Jewish way of thinking that to understand is an ethical and spiritual activity. To sit and learn is an ethical. The progress of our understanding is an ethical progress and a spiritual progress, and brings us closer to God. However you understand God, that is so very Jewish.
Yes, that's why the words, the intellectual love of God, I mean, to my ears sounds so Maimonidean.
So yes.
Of course, he wasn't the only one who used that term, but that is an essential impulse.
Yes. Listen, I'm telling you, when I was lecturing at Columbia, when I was teaching there on Spinoza, talking, about the intellectual love of God, and suddenly I found myself saying Hashem, and I was like, oh my God. So inappropriate. Not, first of all, most of my students know what I was talking about. I had to explain, but yes, that somehow that Jewish flavor of to understand is spiritual. It's ethical. This is how we remake ourselves.
Just to clarify for our listeners, Dr. Goldstein did grow up in an Orthodox,
yes.
religious environment. So
yes.
that would have been your sort of fallback in your own head for a very, a God with whom you have this loving relationship.
Exactly. I was feeling the love. And so I said Hashem. Yes.
Right. It's interesting that you bring up Kabbalah and prior, other streams of Jewish thought, because of course, on the one hand, Spinoza is very much part of that story, but also, as you say, his radicalism was such a rejection of that, because of course, the major point made by Kabbalists and really by all Jewish thinkers is that at the very beginning, at least at the very beginning, there was an act of supernal will that created the world, that got the world into being. And the Kabbalists make a big deal of this. They talk the whole process of Tzimtzum, of God willingly self-contracting God's self, I suppose, in order to create space for the universe. And therefore, everything that follows from that, even if everything after that's entirely mechanistic, so that initial act of will demonstrates a kind of a love or a kind of a care on the part of God for everything else. Whereas Spinoza, that's the thing he uproots. There is no primordial moment of caringness. And that is the grand rebellion in a way.
Absolutely. But that the Kabbalists were obsessed with those two questions. Where does it all come from? Which philosophers were really not asking so much, and suffering. these are the two things that I think continue to obsess Spinoza. I mean, yeah, no, he's terrible. You know, he talks about the mad ravings of the Kabbalists. I mean, he's no fan of them, but there's something in what bothered them that bothers Spinoza as well. He's such a fascinating character. Oh,
even if you would argue that he tries his damnedest not to be. In other
yes,
words,
yes.
he's an exceptionally boring life. You know, writes these very geometrical, sort of sparse and austere philosophical arguments, and
Yes.
yet manages to be among the most fascinating intellectuals, and is studied intensely to this day.
Absolutely. Did you ever read Isaac Bashevis Singer's story, The Spinoza of Market Street? It's a short story.
I confess I haven't. Could you enlighten us?
It's a really good story. It's about a professor of who teaches Spinoza, who's such a Spinozist, and who quotes Spinoza, propositions, scholia, everything, who falls in love, and well, I don't want to spoiler alert, but the last line is.
It's okay. I think
Okay, I mean, and he falls in love with a. She's not beautiful. She's not rich. She's not intelligent. A very simple, kind woman, and he's a great professor. In his sly way, he talks about the miracle that happens on the wedding night. That this desiccated old professor rises to the occasion, so to speak. And the last line is, divine Spinoza, I have become a fool. It's just, it's very, it's very touching.
But perhaps reflecting that from a Jewish perspective, certainly from Bashevis Singer's perspective, to become a fool from a Spinozan perspective is desirable. It may not do to dwell permanently on the heights of perfect rationality. You can't live that way.
It's hard. It's hard.
Not to gore any particular ox here, but
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, can I just say one other thing in favor of Spinoza's?
Please, yes, of course.
My teachers would have called the pintaloid, right? The little right inside of him. So, towards the very end of his life, he's sadly dying at a very young age. He ground optical instruments very, very well. Huygens, the great Dutch astronomer, would only use lenses from who he called our Israelite, our Jew. And that's how he was known, even after he was excommunicated. But he gets this letter, Spinoza, from a student, Albert Berg, who a Calvinist. He had been a Calvinist. His father was a prominent Calvinist person in Amsterdam, and he had been visiting Rome, and he became enamored, enchanted, converted to Catholicism, and he writes to Spinoza in a very insulting way. That you are so arrogant, you think you see the truth, and you worm, it's very
all the greatest hits.
Yeah, very depressing letter you get from a student, especially at the end of your life. And Spinoza, first doesn't answer, but the father begs him to answer. And then Spinoza says, various things. He says, for example, I don't think I have the best philosophy. I know that I have the one true philosophy. And if you ask me how I know it with the same certainty that I know that the three angles of a triangle add up to the sum of two right angles. It's pure logic, pure math. That's how I know it. But then the student writes back and, gets more and more insulting. And he says, speaks about the long line of witnesses from Jesus to now, and so of course it's true, and the martyrs who have died for Christianity, and the Jew breaks out in Spinoza, and he says, "Look, first of all, you want to talk about the long line of witnesses. The Jews, it goes back much further. They make a claim that it goes back much further, and if you want to talk about martyrdom, I can give you stories from my own lifetime. It's going on right now. And there was one who was called Judah the Believer. And as the flames were mounting, he cries out, Shema. It's so interesting to me that, when push comes to shove, when this guy is trying to tell Spinoza that he ought to be a Catholic and using these kinds of arguments, he responds as a Jew, and that's very interesting to me. And that he seems, even though it's nonsense, it's narishkeit, there's something transcendent about this story of this Judah the Believer that touches Spinoza. I do think that his community, his formative community, lived on in him.
However much he rebelled against it.
However much he rebelled against it, yeah.
So I was going to say, I'd like to end off by asking a question I asked to many of my guests, which is as follows: is for you, if you could sit down tonight to dinner with Spinoza, what are you asking him?
What am I asking? I think I would ask him about that last thing that we were talking about. What was his feeling about his community? Is there something about it that continued to move him, even through all the great progress of his understanding, even though there really was no room for it in his worldview? Was there? I guess maybe I'd want to know in what way he would confess to some inconsistency in himself. Were there any inconsistencies? I mean, the man was flesh and blood. Were there any inconsistencies there? I think I would want to know that. Maybe because I'm such an inconsistent Spinoza. But
that seems fair enough. I was half expecting you to say something along the lines of, I wouldn't ask him anything because his whole system's out there, and just fits together.
Well, that's true. I would not ask him about any proposition in the ethics because, working hard enough over the years, I understand how they all follow. I see how he gets to them, and they all make sense. No, I'd want to know about him, the man.
That's fair. That's eminently fair. Okay, Dr. Rebecca Goldstein, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm very, very grateful for your time with us, and thank you for enlightening us to the life and thought of Baruch Spinoza.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, J.J. Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.